Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, I'll discuss how to build a project team. I'll show you how to build a stakeholder analysis using an ARMI tool. There are two prerequisites for this lesson, which are the key roles in the Lean or Six Sigma project and also the CAP model. Right now, let's talk about how to build a project team. Well, for building a project team, I recommend that you start with a top-down approach. That basically means when you review the project with each of those different levels, starting at the top with the sponsor and working yourself down, be sure to ask who would be the next layer of team members underneath that person. For example, if you're starting with the sponsor at the top, ask the sponsor, who do you think the champion would be? Then as you talk with that champion, ask that person, who do you think this process owner would be? And then with the process owner, you could then ask, who do you think the SMEs or the subject matter experts would be? That way you're working from the top, working all the way down to identify those different team members that you would want to include. Now, as you identify those folks, make sure that you talk to each one of those team members. I strongly recommend that you at least talk, call, or visit with them and with one-on-one and try to find out several things. And here's some suggested questions. Do they agree with the problem statement they've already defined? And do they agree with the scope of the project? Do they agree with the other folks who are included on the team? That is, who was included. Maybe they think that some people should be excluded or there should be additional people included. What's the level of expertise or experience that they have with that particular problem that you're trying to solve in the project? And who are the other potential stakeholders for the project that should be included? And be sure that if you would get any no answers from them for any of those questions, that you probe them a little bit more, because you might find out that there are other team members who feel the same exact way, and you may find it could change the entire direction for the project. Now, if you see there's any conflict between any of your team members, or at least in their agreement or disagreement with the focus for the project, try to resolve that team conflict immediately. It's not uncommon for a process owner or a SME who's at a little bit lower level to have conflicting opinions about the project's direction that came from the champion or sponsor level. So it's not uncommon for that to happen. But if there is a disagreement on some major point in the project, for example, as far as the priority level for the project or the scope, then try to get that resolved as quickly as possible. Don't ignore it, because it will not go away. And it'll be much better off getting it resolved in the very beginning before you get too much farther into the project. You might find that some team members may not actually tell you that they disagree or have a lack of support for a particular project, but their behavior might tell you otherwise. So look for key behaviors, like some folks who don't return calls or don't respond to emails, or they're late for meetings, or you might find that there's a lot of negative comments you hear every now and then, or maybe some indifference as far as their involvement. These types of folks may not be bad apples, quote unquote. They might actually be good people, and they might become your greatest advocate. So it's really important, if you notice that kind of behavior in folks, that you try to listen to them. Do some extra engagement with them to understand their perspective of why it seems like they're not fully involved. Where do they really disagree? Again, because they might have some very valid points that could change the whole direction for the project. This is actually something that I did experience once on the project, where it was a vice president who asked for this project and gave clear direction of what we were trying to do. And he gave direction of who the different people would be, the champion and the process owner, who that would be involved. But when I tried to engage the process owner was not responding to my emails or calls. They were very disengaged. So it was really difficult to make any progress, because I needed to meet with this person in order to get some good progress. So I just dropped in on the person. Since they weren't responding to me, I just dropped in on them, and we just had a great one-to-one discussion. And what I found out is that they had a completely different perspective and disagreed with the direction from the vice president. So when I tried to communicate it from the vice president's perspective, as we talked through those things, they finally understood the perspective. And actually, that particular process owner, in the very beginning of the project, not just in that circumstance, but as we began to meet with the team and through other situations, they tended to be very negative in their approach, bring up a lot of negative aspects, and played often the devil's advocate. But what I found is I tried to leverage that person and try to work with them to get their perspective and raise the priority level for them in the project, because it was in some way how they typically responded, and that was somewhat of their behavior. But the more I put more focus on them, then they actually became more positive. By the end of the project, that person was not only opposite of what they were in the beginning when they were disengaged, they were the most engaged of anyone. They were coming to me for additional opportunities that they found, and going the extra mile in many ways voluntarily in order to see the project succeed. So that example, it's not always going to happen for everyone, but at least it can happen that if you see certain folks like that disengage from what you're doing, try to make every effort to get them involved and work with them, because it actually can end up being much better in the long run if you do that. Also, when you build the project team, it may take a lot of time, but it's really well worth the investment. Having that right team should give you the right confidence that you're going to find the right solutions more quickly. So when you have a project that's well scoped, then your team size should actually be somewhere between 5 to 10 people. If it gets larger than 10 people, chances are it may not be scoped appropriately. You might have to readjust that. But let that number of about 10 people be an ideal maximum range for what you'd expect on the team. Again, because if you have too many folks, chances are it might be too complex, or your scope could be too large, or you might find that it's going to really delay some of the progress in the project. So just take that into consideration as a caution if you see it beyond 10 people, and just make that account for that somehow in your evaluation of whether you should drill down to either in the scope or at least in the members of the team itself.
Now I'd like to introduce you to the stakeholder analysis as defined in the ARMI tool.
Well, what is a stakeholder analysis? It's a tool that's going to help us evaluate who the project stakeholders are and the level of support that we believe they would have for the project that we're trying to work. Now, what does ARMI mean, A-R-M-I? Well, it refers to the 4 different levels that you might assign the different stakeholders in the actual analysis or the project you're working. So it begins with A, referring to the approver of the team decisions, and then R, referring to the resource whose expertise, skills, or their clout may be needed in order to make the project successful. Then the M is referring to a member of the team with some sort of under the authority of the charter itself. And then finally you've got I, which refers to some interested party who should be informed on the direction or findings or whatever comes out of the project. Now, the purpose of the stakeholder analysis is you want to understand all the different business areas that are affected by the particular project, and you identify any potential gaps or conflicts within the level of support by those stakeholders. That is there a gap between how much you think certain stakeholders agree or disagree or are willing to support your project? And then it helps plan for what stakeholders that you need to talk to and how you can talk through them to kind of increase their support if you think they're somewhat lacking. Now, the stakeholder analysis, or this ARMI, is a way to help identify any risk of acceptance. The goal is not that we want to be perfectly accurate or have some agreed upon assessment for each person's support, but the goal is that we want to identify any perceived gaps or any potential gaps that are out there in the support for any particular person or any particular stakeholder. Remember, each of these gaps represents a risk of acceptance. If we refer back to GE's CAP model, Q times A equals E, which is the quality of the improvement is multiplied by the acceptance of those for implementing it, is equal to the effectiveness or the success of that particular improvement. Well, the risk of acceptance, that A piece, could be huge because it could mean a failure in getting an effective improvement implemented. So we want to ask, how can we improve the gaps that we might see in the support for certain folks in order to gain some stronger support for the project and help ensure that the project is successful?
Now let's look at an example of the ARMI tool to give you an idea of what this looks like.
So what I'll show now is a fictitious example of an ARMI, of what it might look like as far as the outline and the structure of the ARMI and how you might build one. So in this particular example, we break it down between, as color-coded here, the core team members at the top, and then underneath of that other key stakeholders, then underneath of that some additional support from folks. So we might list the names of those folks under this column here for stakeholders, and we might identify next the title that they might have or the level of influence that we might expect them to have within our particular project. And then next to that, we break out the DMAIC methodology in each of the 5 different phases and identify the level of support where we think that person is, or the role they might play within each of the phases of the project. That is, are they, again, an approver, or are they a member, which is the M, or are they a resource that's used for the team, or are they an interested party? And they might change over time. We might find that we're drawing on some resources at different layers within different phases of the project. As it progresses or as it moves on, we might find we don't need a person any longer, but we only need them at key points within the project. So by looking at it by phase, you might see when it is that you might engage with certain folks and when you might need to disengage with certain folks. And finally, off to the far right, we've got this column where we're doing our own assessment of how strongly, moderately, or how low the support is that each person we think is giving toward the particular project. So this is only a general idea. It's just our perception based off of talking with each of these folks, but it's really important for us to just understand where we think a person is. Are they someone who's strongly supportive of this project, moderately supportive, or do they actually have low support? And that's really what we want to try to understand as we continue to work through to figure out how we can increase or gain stronger support from some of these different stakeholders.
Now we'll talk about how you can build a stakeholder analysis using the tool.
When we want to build a stakeholder analysis like using this ARMI tool, there's several steps we can follow as we try to build it. First, we'll identify all the core team members and all those outside stakeholders and any additional support that's needed. Again, break those folks out between the 3 different groups that are identified here within the actual ARMI tool itself. Next, for each of those people, we'll identify the type of support that we think that might contribute to each of the project phases. Again, as I showed, we break it down by each of the phases within the DMAIC methodology and kind of figure out what role each person is going to play within each one of those phases. And then we want to estimate the level of support that we think each person may have toward the entire project. Again, are they strongly supportive, only moderately supportive, or do they have low support for this project? Then, once we've identified that, we want to review the analysis with the team to get their feedback. Go over the list with everyone involved, at least on the core team, and make sure that they agree with this layout and they agree with the level of support that we think each of these people have. And for any stakeholder who has less than strong support, we want to discuss with the team how is it that we can improve their support to some higher level and try to evaluate the level of risk each person could contribute to the project and how you might prioritize those. For example, if you're looking at the core team members, these represent the biggest risk because they're core team members and they don't have strong support. So these are the folks you probably want to start with since they're a part of the core team. Next, you might want to work with the executive stakeholders, and those who have lower support, we might want to work with them to try to win their support because they could be really instrumental as well. And then finally, any of the additional folks, the additional support folks that we have, it's important that we want to increase them, but it's going to be less risk if they have low support for it because they're not playing as critical role in the team. Now, it doesn't mean we don't care about their opinion or their support, but it's not going to be as high a priority for us to try to increase it, especially compared to the core team members. So just take that into consideration. We at least want to start with the core team members to increase their support, and then least in priority is the additional support folks that we have. Then we might want to focus on them last.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
Well, I would challenge you to think of 2 different project teams that you are a part of, whether it's on a personal level or at work, and try to answer a few of these questions. Were the roles and expectations clearly defined for each of those teams? And if they weren't, then what was the impact by not having those roles or expectations clearly defined? That is, did it create some additional confusion? Did it create some political battles or maybe lack of participation from folks? And was there anyone that had low support at the beginning of the project? If there was, then how did the project leader or others who were involved, how did they handle those types of folks that had low support? And did the support from that person improve by the end of the project? Did they actually become someone who is more supportive? If so, then what do you think influenced the change in behavior for that particular person? And was there anyone that started with high support, but actually the reverse happened? They actually decreased to a low support level. And if so, then how did the project leader or others handle that type of situation? And what is it that you think influenced that change in that person's level of support? And finally, what is it that you would do differently in building a team that could prevent some of the problems that you might have experienced in these other project team examples?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results.
I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.